Welcome to the Holistic Health Show, where the worlds of science and spirituality converge to illuminate a path towards total well-being. Join us as we embark on a journey to bridge the gap between Western medicine and complementary therapies, offering you a roadmap to embrace a proactive, holistic approach to your health. It's time to empower yourself with choices that nurture your body, mind, and soul. Welcome to a world of infinite possibilities for your optimal health. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Holistic Health Show. I'm excited to have you join us again today for another guest episode. Today on the show, we have Sonia Zadro. Sonia is a clinical psychologist and a PhD candidate at Bonn University, focusing in energy healing and Reiki. Welcome to the show, Sonia.
Thanks, Amy.
Wonderful to have you here. So today you're actually going to be presenting some of the research that you've been doing throughout your completion of your PhD.
Yeah. So as you can imagine, doing a PhD on energy medicine, energy healing, Reiki is a very alternative area. And it took me a very long time to find someone who was willing to supervise me. And, as far as I know, I don't know whether there have been any others. Probably not, but I could be
That's going
wrong.
to be my next question. Yeah. Has it
Okay.
been done before? Yeah.
So, it took a really long time to find someone because, we're talking about an entire paradigm of healing medicine, however you want to refer to it, that isn't, is at odds with the dominant biomedical model that our medical system operates under. I wanted to do this because I was aware that there was research in this field and there was some good research in the field and no one seemed to know about it. I think 20 years ago, 15 years ago when I was looking for a supervisor, I was aware of some research even back then. And I rang many academics, talking to them about it, asking them to supervise me, and even they didn't seem to know about any of the research that was around at that time. And finally, I did find someone, Associate Professor Dr. Peter Stapleton at Bond University, who's a leader in EFT research, emotional freedom technique. She's done loads and loads of research in that, and she's a world leader in that research. And I managed to convince her to supervise me. And so I'm halfway through that PhD now. And I've actually already published my first study already in a grade 1 journal, Frontiers Journal, which is actually on PubMed if you Google it. So that's the systematic review of the effectiveness of Reiki over placebo in treating mental health conditions. In looking at energy healing, I needed to, because it's obviously such a big area, my supervisor said, you need to focus on one particular field of one particular type of energy healing. You can't just do it on everything. So knowing that Reiki had been around for a very long time, I'd had some experience myself with Reiki. I thought, why not? So I focused on Reiki, and the very first study I've done, I'm doing 3 studies in the field of energy healing and Reiki. And the first one, it was basically just to look at the evidence. And I guess the thing with energy medicine, energy healing, because it doesn't fit the dominant biomedical paradigm, people generally think it works because we think it's going to work. In other words, they think it works because it's a placebo effect. For those that don't understand what a placebo effect is, it's basically the idea that when you take a sugar pill and someone says, here, have a Panadol for your headache, and they give you a sugar pill and it works because you believe it's going to work. You believe that it's a Panadol and your headache gets better. And that's the placebo effect. And the placebo effect is incredibly powerful. It changes our very biology. It changes our, how our brain functions. They've done some extraordinary studies on the placebo effect. And so often people will be quite dismissive of energy medicine and even some complementary medicines, and especially energy healing, because it's so sort of woo-woo, and just say, well, that's great, that it works. But, we all know it's probably just a placebo effect. So I thought, well, is there research out there to see whether Reiki is more than a placebo effect? And there is. So what I did is I did a very large review. I reviewed 11 different databases. I think it was 10 or 11, a lot anyway. And found lots and lots of studies on the effectiveness of Reiki over placebo. But I had to only use studies that were quite rigorous scientifically. They had to have, for example, outcome measures that were validated and reliable.
Right.
They had to include a placebo. They had to have, basically comply with a whole lot of scientific standards. And those that did comply left me with 27 randomized
Okay.
controlled trials that controlled for placebo. And I really want to point out that most randomized controlled studies, which are considered the gold standard in science, don't control for placebo. I'm a psychologist, I'm a clinical psychologist. When you do research on, for example, does cognitive behavior therapy work? Or, I'm a trauma adult psychologist. I do work a lot with trauma. I work a lot with clinical depression and anxiety, been doing so for 25 years. So I'm very familiar with all the research, and you can't really control for placebo properly in those studies. You can't say, okay, let's do cognitive behavior therapy with this group and let's pretend to do cognitive behavior therapy with another group and see whether it works because you're pretending. It's just not really possible. So they usually use a waitlist control, or they compare it with another study, which is still good research, but it's not really effectively controlling for placebo. So with the Reiki studies that did control for placebo, what they did was 2 or 3 ways, but the main way is that they get the people to send Reiki to recipients.
Yeah.
They might have, 30 people receiving Reiki, and then what they do is they get another person to send pretend Reiki, or what they call sham Reiki. So the people receiving the Reiki don't know whether they're getting real Reiki or whether they're getting pretend Reiki.
So I just have a question on that.
Mm.
As many people listening will know, I'm a Reiki practitioner. So I'm curious, the people who were giving Reiki, okay, they were giving Reiki, so they'd been attuned. The people giving pretend Reiki, were they still attuned?
No, they're not
Yeah, okay.
attuned. There
That
was
was kind
one
of.
study where they were, and that was actually discarded. Actually, I think that study, the subjects weren't randomized properly. I had to discard it anyway, but I would have probably discarded it anyway, because I know that
Yeah.
you can't have
You
people
don't
doing
turn it
sham
on.
Reiki who have been attuned, because
Yeah.
Reiki can flow even when you're not
Yeah.
thinking about it. Like, on occasion, I have done Reiki. I have been attuned a very long time ago. I've never practiced it professionally, just something I've done with friends, family. So I have an idea of how it works and that kind of stuff. So what you do is you compare this group of people who've received real Reiki with people who've received sham Reiki, in a very controlled environment. Sometimes the people who are receiving the Reiki or sham Reiki, then they're blindfolded, they can't hear anything. Maybe they're not even touched, their hands are just nearby. So there's no other kind of things that could be influencing them, like body language and so forth. It's
Okay.
highly controlled. Obviously, some studies control those things better than others. And if the outcomes show that Reiki is statistically significant in being more effective than the placebo group, then we can assume that the effect isn't the result of placebo, that it's not just because the person thinks it's going to work. There are other criticisms to that. If we get really, really scientific about it, we might say, oh, well, maybe the people sending the Reiki, maybe it works because the people who send it believe that it works, and that's affecting their electromagnetic fields, and it's affecting the subject's electromagnetic fields. And that's a good argument. I think that's worth considering. However, they have even done 2 or 3 studies where they have given fake attunements to people.
Oh, yeah.
So they believe that they're doing, although that had a lot of methodological problems and so was discarded. In another study, it did work still, even when that happened, although it's only one study, so they probably needed to be more. But yeah, so they have really looked at this. There is some good research that really looks at this issue of, is the placebo effect operating? And so, when we look at the outcomes, basically, in looking at all these 27 studies, what I did was I separated them into areas. So I separated them into the studies which looked at depression, anxiety, stress, pain, blood pressure, and so forth. And then I actually divided them further, because what I was finding was there was inconsistency in their results. And the reason for that, I found when I looked at it, and I'm surprised no one else had looked at it, is that when you actually look at, for example, take anxiety, right? They were doing studies to see whether Reiki was effective for anxiety over placebo, but they were doing it on people who weren't anxious to begin with.
Oh.
When you look at their baseline anxiety scores on
Hmm.
the what's called a DAS or an STAI or whatever measure you're using, their baseline anxiety scores were in the normal range. And so you've got to ask the question, is someone who's not anxious to begin with going to be influenced by any treatment very much? You know?
Yeah.
Probably
Okay.
not. You know?
Yeah.
Likewise for depression, there were a number of studies that looked at whether Reiki was effective at improving people depression scores in people who weren't depressed or people who
Hmm.
weren't stressed or people with low blood pressure. Why would it make a statistically significant difference? And so that's exactly what I found. So when I separated the baseline scores from those who had clinical levels of anxiety, depression, stress, blood pressure, even pain, I saw a trend. We found that Reiki was more effective than placebo, and there was a real trend for that. And there was actually, when you apply what you're calling, when you do a systematic review, you need to apply, it's a very rigorous process. You have to use what's called a Cochrane risk of bias tool, and you applied a grade assessment. And so when you apply these really rigorous sort of scientific assessments to these studies, even though there weren't a large number of studies, there might have been between 2 and 5 studies per each area. When you apply all these rigorous standards, you still found a high level of evidence that Reiki was more
Okay.
effective than placebo for clinical anxiety, for clinical depression, the clinical levels of stress, for high blood pressure. High and elevated blood pressure was a high level of evidence that Reiki was more effective than placebo. Even normal levels of stress, there was some evidence, a moderate level, low to moderate level of evidence. Basically, there was one study that showed Reiki was more effective than placebo and one didn't. So there probably needs to be more research
Yeah.
on that. Acute pain. So they looked at whether Reiki was more effective than placebo on people who'd just undergone an operation of some kind. And they found that in all those studies, again, that it was more effective. And it wasn't just more effective, but where I've ranked the evidence high, it wasn't just statistically significant, but you have in research what's called a large effect size. And those areas, so it's not just significant, it's not just real, the effect, it's a big effect. It's
Okay.
a really big effect. So in all those areas that I ranked a high level of evidence, it wasn't just because it was all the studies showed significance. It was because most of the studies, if not all, had large effect sizes. There was a really big
Okay.
effect, if that makes sense. So yeah. So, you know, certainly for clinical areas such as stress, anxiety, depression, high blood pressure, acute pain, moderate to high level of evidence in all those areas. Other areas, the effects were moderate or low. So, for example, things like, I think for salivary cortisol, reducing salivary cortisol, and there was one other area where there was no evidence as well. So breathing rate, they found breathing rate and salivary cortisol, there was none of the studies supported the effectiveness of Reiki over placebo. Um, heart rate variability, there was a moderate level of evidence. Chronic pain or just chronic conditions, low to moderate levels of evidence. You've got to keep in mind too, that either means that Reiki isn't effective over placebo for those conditions, or it may mean that there wasn't a big enough dose. So you have to take into account, you know, maybe, you know, they needed multiple applications of Reiki or bigger doses, you know, that kind of thing. So you wouldn't rule them out completely at this stage, if that makes
So
sense.
were they done, was this, I guess, analyzed or looked at after just one Reiki treatment, or did they go through a course of Reiki treatments?
So it depends on which area you're looking at. So for example, blood pressure, I think it was just a single treatment, or one study did multiple treatments and actually found that the effects were cumulative, so that the
Okay.
blood pressure improved even more and more over time, over I
Okay.
think 6 weeks, 6 or 7 weeks. But all the other studies on blood pressure, it was just a single application, 30 to 45 minutes of Reiki improved blood pressure over placebo
Right.
when the blood pressure was high to begin with.
Okay. Yeah.
When it was not high to begin with, it only improved diastolic. Let me just check that. It only improved diastolic blood pressure. It didn't improve systolic blood pressure. So the jury's out on that. But again, do you need to use Reiki for blood pressure if your blood pressure is normal to begin with anyway?
Yeah. I mean,
You know,
are you really
so
improving blood pressure if
it's not really relevant.
normal?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So blood pressure, only one application. Things like depression, anxiety, it varied, you know, for some of the studies, for example, for anxiety, I think one study only used one application and it reduced anxiety over placebo. Most of them used multiple applications over several weeks.
Okay.
Likewise for depression, it was multiple applications over several weeks to reduce clinical depression and stress as well. Multiple applications over several weeks. In fact, for normal stress, it was multiple applications over several weeks and quite a high dose. I think it was 90-minute sessions. It reduced even normal levels of stress. So it really varies. And I guess that's something that the research, you know, obviously needs to control a bit better. They need to look at the dosage a bit more carefully when they do the studies.
Yeah. And what does reducing something like normal levels of stress look like? To me, reducing something that's normal is
All it would mean is that the average score before they have Reiki, which would still be in the normal range, drops, you know, obviously compared to the average score after they have Reiki,
I see.
has dropped significantly. When you apply a statistical significant method to analyze the difference, that there's less than 5% chance that would have happened by chance. There's less than 5% that would have happened by chance. That's what a statistical significant difference is. It's just a random, an arbitrary, you know, level of significance which the scientific community sets at 0.05 or 5%. And if there's less than 5% chance that we're going to find that difference, they say it's statistically significant.
Right.
And then, as I said, then you look at how large the effect is as well, and if the effect size is more than what's 0.8, then it's a very large effect. So, yeah, so that's what they found as well. And I guess the other thing to point out as well is that the most highly controlled studies of Reiki over placebo are the ones done on non-human living systems.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, they've looked at, again, you know, these are really highly controlled studies because they can be. You know, you do it on cells and you do it on rats and things like that. And you don't expect the placebo effect to be operating with rats and cells, do you? You know, but even though you don't expect the placebo effect to be operating with rats and cells, they still had a placebo group. They still compared it in all these studies just to cover their bases with placebo Reiki, just to make sure, because maybe the rats picked up on something, you know? I don't know how the cell could have, but anyway. And they actually found in all these studies that Reiki was more effective than placebo. So, for
Even in the rats and
example,
the cells.
yeah, likewise with the cells. So for rats, they found that Reiki was more effective than placebo at reducing microvascular damage, so damage to the cells that was brought on by noise. They found that it increased survival of cells that had been irradiated and in rats. And there's a whole host of other findings they found. Another one was that it reduced pain after female dogs had an ovarian hysterectomy. So they did it on dogs as well.
Wow.
So they've done some really...
How do they, what is the word I'm looking for, determine the pain levels of the dogs before and after?
That's actually a really good question. And to be honest with you, I've got to be really frank, I can't remember how they determine the pain levels in the dogs, because that's an excellent question. I remember how they did other aspects of the experiment, but yeah, I can't remember now how they determined the pain levels. Maybe they measured cortisol or something in the blood or the stress hormone. I'm not sure, but I'd have to check that one. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all right.
But yeah, they have done a range of other studies which have been really interesting as well.
Mm. And then what about the cells? So how did they determine that Reiki was better than placebo in so was this in a cell, or do you mean in the cells in the rats? What
So
might
I
follow
guess they
there?
would have looked at the cells pre and post the Reiki and pre and post the placebo Reiki and
Mm.
just measured the degree of damage to those
Oh
cells
yeah.
somehow and then analysed whether that difference was statistically significant.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
And likewise with heart rate homeostasis in the rats, they would have they would have measured their heart rate and
Yeah.
looked at the differences in measurements. Yeah.
So it's
So
looking promising.
yeah,
It's
so that
looking
was
good for Reiki.
it's really interesting because it's so controlled, those sorts of
Yeah.
studies. Yeah,
And
so
what
I
I
think
find interesting is that so you searched 10 or 11 different databases and then you came up with a certain amount of research. And it sounds like there's actually been, whether or not it's been, properly done or properly controlled research, there's been a lot of attempts at research for Reiki findings. And then so you've narrowed it down to finding those that fit this particular criteria that's
yeah, so
important within research.
I narrowed it down to only studies that control for placebo. So there's a load of
Yeah.
more studies that don't control for placebo, but they do to some degree. They might, for example, have had a waitlist control group, a
Okay.
lot of the other studies, but they haven't had a placebo control group. They haven't had people doing pretend or sham Reiki and comparing it with real Reiki. So I only included studies with a placebo control group. There are a lot of other studies just with waitlist control or just
And
with
what is a waitlist
pre-post.
control?
Waitlist control is just a group of people that have no treatment
Oh,
at all.
just yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Mm,
So they're just that you get a group of depressed people and you give half of them Reiki and you give half of them nothing.
nothing.
Yeah,
Okay.
which is
Yeah,
what
I
they do
see.
with therapy studies,
Yeah.
psychotherapy studies. I've just looked at that and I only focused on adults, although there was only one or two studies I came across that were focused on children.
Mm.
And I only focused on hands-on Reiki, not distant Reiki.
Oh, yeah.
I guess I felt that, given that we're already dealing with something that is, you know, very alternative
Yeah,
and
that people are really questioning.
that people would really question, I thought jumping to distant Reiki is probably a bit of a leap,
Yeah,
and I
maybe
had
do
to
that
narrow
next.
my
Be an
parameters.
interesting one.
What's that?
It would be interesting. Did you come
They have done
across?
research on distant
Yeah,
Reiki,
okay.
and I
Just
have found
much?
studies that
Yeah.
have found it effective. And it's easier to control the studies on distant Reiki too, because it's much easier to say to someone, yeah, we're sending you Reiki,
And you're not.
and just don't send it.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
much easier to compare those people with
Yeah,
the real
yeah.
Reiki receivers. So yeah, I mean,
Interesting.
it's a whole different. We're looking at a sort of a skeptic would just be very dismissive of the field. So we have this thing called the dominant biomedical paradigm, which is very sort of bottom up. We go down to the organs, then we go to the cells, and then we, go deeper and deeper into smaller levels and try and find out the cause of things. Whereas we have this sort of emerging field now called biofield science, which is the idea that health and wellness is not just determined by the biomedical worldview of cells and particles and molecules and everything within the biomechanical system, but it's also another way of viewing it is top down. So it's this idea that any living system has an organizing energy field behind it. And that organizing energy field helps to regulate the system and helps to maintain the system and keep it healthy.
Mm.
So when you look at sort of energy medicine or energy healing, the idea is that it's affecting this thing called the biofield and helping to balance the biofield and regulate it. And then that has a top-down effect rather than a bottom-up effect, which is what the biomedical sort of dominant paradigm tends to focus on. So I guess, this sort of emerging field, it's new and it's still not accepted by mainstream science. And there's various reasons for that. It's one of the reasons is that it's still not completely well understood. It's still not properly understood in terms of the causal factors of the biofield. Some might think it could clash with the dominant paradigm, that it might be inconsistent. Others say, well, why would it be inconsistent? It's not mutually exclusive. It can work with the dominant paradigm. Another big block behind it is that there are obviously spiritual associations with energy healing, and even sometimes religious associations, which is obviously rejected by mainstream science. And the other thing is even if you just put the spiritual and religious associations aside, the idea of the biofield often has this idea that there's a life force, that the biofield is the life force behind consciousness. And that's an idea that's actually historically been around for probably over a century. And it's always been firmly rejected by modern medicine, that idea. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's some really deep fundamental beliefs about the way we understand our world, and that with the way we understand humans, that the idea of energy medicine and energy healing challenges, and that are going to be obviously really big hurdles for scientifically minded people, or people that subscribe to a very dominant biomedical way of thinking, which are understandable, totally understandable. But I guess what I'm suggesting is that, look, even if we don't fully understand the causes of something from a scientific perspective, or a worldview that doesn't fit your worldview, the research does provide a lot of evidence at this stage that these things are working when we apply the science to it, that they work over placebo. And rather than just going, oh, but they just can't because I don't understand how, it's like, well, the science is showing that there is quite a bit of evidence that they do at this stage. So why don't we look at why? Why not, if they're helping people, why not use them, especially when, there is such a need for it?
Yeah, so non-invasive. We really don't like, or we steer clear of what we don't understand.
I think it's when for some people doing something when they don't properly understand it, they're not comfortable with it. And that's their right. That's their
Yeah.
right. They're entitled to do that. But I guess in the big scheme of things, we're spending billions and billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars internationally on health every year.
Mm.
Here we have a particular healing modality that, as far as we know from the research, is safe. As far as we know, it's effective, and it's not just a placebo effect. It's even more than that. And it's much less expensive, far less expensive than a lot of other options. And why not use it at least as an adjunct? Why not use it as an addition, an additional supportive therapy to help people with whatever they're doing, they're doing in mainstream medicine? It's gentle, it's non-invasive. As far as we know, it's safe. And the research is supporting it. As a psychologist with 25 years experience, I know there's some really good therapies out there. There's some great psychotherapies out there that are effective. But sometimes you have clients who who wouldn't want to access all the help they could get? And some clients, their problems are really deeply entrenched. So why not use other modalities to help them along, as well as psychotherapy?
And we even see, I mean, I know in the United States, Reiki is in hospitals across the country. I think it's something like over 800 of them.
Wow, is it
So
that much now?
I think it is. And I could be wrong, but I do think that was the number I found when I was looking it up a few weeks ago. And I mean, there's even I think it's the Solaris Center over in Perth.
Yeah, St John of God Hospital over in Perth advertise using Reiki just as an option for outpatient care. I think it's for their cancer patients.
It is. I think it's for anyone undergoing chemo, is it?
I'm not
Correct me if
I'm
I'm
not sure if
wrong.
they're undergoing chemo, but certainly for their outpatient
Hmm.
services, they offer it as an option. And I think it's
Yeah.
also suggested in New South Wales Health in their cancer pamphlets.
Oh, yeah.
I have to double check that. But,
Yeah, look this up.
so it's sort of out there and there's an awareness around it. But I think people just don't know a lot about it, or there's a resistance to it, or
Mm.
there's a bit of a wariness or tentative to it because it belongs to, because it's a type of energy healing and it's, people see
Yeah.
it as a bit woo-woo and all that kind of
And a
thing.
lot of people, what I've been hearing is people saying, it's new, but it's actually really not. It's really, Reiki's been
No,
around for, a long time,
yeah. I mean, when was it?
so,
I can't remember now when.
well, we just
Is
had
it,
100 years of Reiki,
yeah, is it like
Yeah.
100 years or something? So
Yeah.
it's been around for quite a while and it's spread throughout the globe. And yeah, geez, hasn't it spread? So, there's been time there in order to, I guess, get a sense of what this type of therapy does and, whether it's safe, whether it's effective, what kinds of things it tends to help with. And I think most people would generally say that Reiki is a very, very gentle, relaxing
Hmm.
type of treatment.
I always enjoy my
Um,
sessions.
yes, I'm sure you do.
Yeah,
So yeah, so I think it's certainly an option that is worth considering,
certainly.
with things like mental health, with things like maybe blood pressure, with things like pain, definitely.
Mm.
There's quite a lot of research on pain.
Symptom relief. And like you said, it's not non-invasive, it's safe, it's not going to cause more harm. So,
And some of the studies, not many, but some of the studies look at its long-term effects too. So for stress, for blood
mm,
pressure, there is a little bit of research to suggest that the effects are long-term. And certainly there was a really big study on blood pressure that suggested that it was the effects were not only long-term but cumulative, that the blood
yeah,
pressure
great.
reduced more and more every time over the weeks that it was done. It's really interesting area to look at, uh, because I think it challenges the most fundamental questions of
Mm,
how we understand our health and the universe, I suppose, if you're a scientist. And it's it's for that reason it's exciting. Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's exciting anyway.
I do too. Having grown up with it, it's great to hear that there's research out there that supports it. Even though, I've always known it works. It's been, fundamental in my health and wellness and in many members of my family. So, but having the research to back that up, it's really nice. It's good. It's promising. And it just kind of helps you talk about it more confidently to other people, I think. You can feel more.
Definitely. I mean,
Yeah,
I think that if people can at least put things on their website that show, because people these days, they want the research, they want the evidence.
absolutely.
Um, so I think that if you can actually put it on your website, or if someone says, tell me more about it, or how
Mm,
does it work, then it's really important, to be able to say, well, actually, there is research to support Reiki, and actually not only to support it, but that it's actually more than a placebo effect. There is some good research to support that. And that it's not just, a moderate level of evidence at this stage. It's a moderate to high and sometimes high
mm.
level of evidence, even though there's not, a lot of studies. So, yeah, and they can go
Are
and
there
read it themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any studies ongoing now that you know of? Or would you not really know that they're happening until they've been done and
Well, I
published,
mean,
I
I
guess?
guess when you do a study, you do have to register it often. And
Okay.
so if you went on one of the registers, one of the register sites to see what studies are going on, you
Mm,
can
okay.
have a look at that. And I guess one of the other things that I found, which I'm incorporating into my PhD, is that, I guess it's one thing to look at the research, but I think it's important to get some objective feedback about, well, we can sort of assume what people's attitudes are to Reiki,
Hmm.
and energy healing, but unless we have the research, we can't really be sure. So my second study is actually on attitudes towards Reiki,
Yeah, I'm
which
really interested to hear.
Yeah, I
as
mean, when
well.
I did a literature review on this, honestly, there's virtually nothing on this internationally. There's one study in England that touches on it. There's one study that touches on spiritual healing in Australia that's fairly old. But there's not a lot out there. There is there is a decent amount of research on health professionals' attitudes towards complementary medicine.
Mm,
There's just not a lot in this area, particularly in Australia. So I did do a national study on just the general population, the general community's attitudes towards Reiki, energy healing, and complementary medicine, and also health professionals' attitudes. So I'm in the process of doing that at the moment. I mean, so far the findings are heading in the direction of I got the respondents to answer 2 questionnaires and a bunch of other questions. And so one questionnaire looked at what are your kind of basic beliefs about complementary medicine, and the
yeah.
other questionnaire was about your attitudes towards people who use energy healing. And
Okay.
what I've found is that there was a distinct difference between medical professionals and other health professionals in terms of
Mm,
their attitudes and beliefs around medicine and complementary medicine. In other words, medical professionals have beliefs around healing and the body that are in line with the biomedical model, and they're not
yeah.
very open to assumptions behind complementary medicine, more holistic ideas of healing, which is kind of to be expected, I guess. I mean, that's their
Yeah.
background, that's their training. But that was different to what even psychologists, osteopaths, chiropractors, a range of other health professionals. And the other thing that I found was that in terms of people's attitudes towards energy healers or people who use energy healing, nurses and massage therapists have far more positive attitudes.
Yeah.
Medical professionals have the most negative attitudes, and psychologists and I think osteos have more negative attitudes than nurses and massage therapists.
Mm,
But I'm not sure whether they differ to medical practitioners significantly. But that was the trend. So it'd be interesting to look at and compare, what people's beliefs are around the research in energy healing and comparing that with the facts, I suppose,
yeah.
how much research there actually is.
My husband, he did a program last year, and one of the courses that he was involved with, it might have been entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
So he put out a questionnaire on CAM, so complementary alternative medicine. It went to our friends, and then they shared it a little bit beyond, and we sent it to some, medical practitioners that we knew, or allied health professionals, etc. And it was a variety of questions, kind of, I think, similar from the sounds of what you're saying on, have you heard of it? Or what do you even think CAM is? We provided a definition, but
Mm,
first we asked what they thought it was.
yeah.
And then, what are your thoughts around it? Have you tried it? Would you? And the results were kind of, it was anonymous, so you don't know who was who, but people could choose to put in if they were a medical health professional or if they weren't. And yeah, the results were in some cases to be expected, but at the end, where they could input comments, it was largely I don't really know enough about it to make a decision.
Yeah.
So I found a lot of that was coming back in this, and I mean, like it was a small sample pool that we had, but yeah, it was just I don't know, and I don't understand it, and
Well, it's
so I
all
can't.
about ignorance, and I don't mean that in a judgmental way. It's just about people having access to information, which is why I'm doing the research I'm doing. People just don't have access to that information. Sometimes it's because they don't seek it out, which I think is
Yeah.
common, but it's also because there's not a lot of information or they don't know how to share.
Even interpreting information that you're getting, because there's both
Yeah,
sides out there.
yeah.
And so what do you end up what's real?
And that's
What's
a
just the
really good
truth?
point, Amy. I mean, as I said, when I did this research, just my first study on the systematic review of effectiveness of Reiki over placebo, someone going in cold and looking at the research would have gone, oh, there's all these inconsistent findings.
Yeah.
But it's only because I've had a background in psychology for 25 years and I'm somewhat familiar with research. I can sort of look at it and go, well, hang on, why are they, why are they looking at the effectiveness of Reiki in people, for depression who have normal depression scores?
Aren't
And
depressed.
has anyone actually
No.
checked their baseline scores and found out what
Yeah.
range they're in? I mean, often they're quoted as being depressed in the title of the study, but when I've gone in and looked at the depression scores, they weren't in the depressed range. They're in the
Yeah.
normal range, and they've even been included in other reviews as being depressed because no one's gone in and checked it.
Kind of done a due
And
diligence. Yeah.
so it's really important to be aware of that. Yeah.
And it's all well and good as well. Like you've said, you can post the research or the links on a website, and which many people do, and that's great. But then when you get in and you're looking at a research paper or charts and tables, I mean, interpreting that, in my very limited experience
Yeah.
reading, diagrams and figures, you just get in and you think, I have no idea what this is. So
Yeah.
you glaze
Yeah.
over
I
it and
mean,
you take whatever information is that popped out.
you take for
You know.
granted, and I probably take for granted, when you do a psych degree and then you're captain to go on and do postgrad, you actually, well, I did anyway, you have to do like 5 years of statistics.
Yeah.
It's really quite traumatic. Couldn't stand it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so, you take that for granted and you know what? They usually have, as you know, the abstract at the beginning of the research paper, which summarizes the findings.
Mm.
But it's might not be as obvious, even if you read an abstract, sometimes the findings aren't as obvious to the average
Yeah.
person on the street, even from reading an abstract. So, and as I've just pointed out, then when you go and analyze the study, it's a whole other can of worms. People think that
Yeah.
it's just very black and white. Oh yeah, they found this or they found, it's not like that at all. It's
Because
really
I'm
quite
thinking
complicated.
back, yeah, in my undergrad, I did a few psych courses. I mean, it was very intro.
Yeah,
And one of them was learning how to read these papers. And I
yeah,
remember the assignments that we had, it was always a group project. The assignments would have only 5 questions. You really felt like you were in kindergarten, like, because the questions seemed so simple, almost to the point of what is this color? It seemed like it should be that obvious.
yeah,
And that she would say on page 1 in the abstract, what is the person, what was the main objective? Or I don't know. It was a really easy question. And our group would mull over that. And you didn't always get it right because they're tough, or
yeah,
in this
yeah.
diagram, what is I don't even know the language anymore to really tell you what the question was. But what I'm saying is it seemed so simple. But when you got in there and looked at it, it absolutely wasn't. It's a skill, for sure, reading those papers and interpreting them. So it's great to have someone, like yourself on the show who can explain it to us and say, these are the findings. I put in the work. And I mean, it was over quite a
Well,
long time, I
yeah, and I
think,
guess
that you've been
another
doing this.
view too. I mean, I was listening to a podcast. I think it might have been 2 years ago now, and it was quite interesting because it was hosted by a medical practitioner. I think she was a GP, and she was interviewing another GP, and they were talking about Reiki,
Okay.
and they were saying, yeah, no, it's great. Reiki's great, and I think the host was saying, well, even if it is a placebo effect, it's still helping.
Mm,
So why not use the placebo effect? And that's another
mhm.
view people take. It's like,
Yeah,
well,
okay.
why is everyone sort of saying the placebo effect's so bad? Why don't
Mm,
we use it? But it can be just sort of, as I said, just written off as a placebo. And it's really
mm,
important that we actually work out what is going on because people make
yeah.
big decisions. If we just sort of write it off as a placebo, then it's very unlikely that, a lot of stakeholders are going to invest in it, like hospitals and so forth, or insurance companies. Whereas if we can establish, to what extent it isn't a placebo, then it has implications for a lot of other things too.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
So are you going to do a study on distant healing?
Not as part of my PhD. I don't know what I'll do when I finish my PhD, but I've done the review. I'm doing the attitudes study,
Mm,
and then the third study will be At the moment, I'm considering looking at hospitals which have integrated Reiki into their programs and just talking to them about how they do that, whether it's been accepted, just the whole process of going about that. And
Yeah.
whether, obviously patients have found it very beneficial, whether it's improved their outcomes, all that kind of stuff, so that, we can sort of find a way forward for making a Reiki accessible to those who are comfortable using
Yeah,
it.
I'd be interested to hear, how these hospitals would have gotten funding and approval to open Reiki, I guess clinics
Yeah,
or centers or
yeah,
within the hospital. I'd be really interested to know more about that for sure.
yeah,
I hope that
definitely.
you'll
I
come
mean, you
back
can only
and
usually
share.
do that with research. So
Yeah.
they've obviously done some research to have
Mm.
achieved it. So yeah.
Well, you'll have to come back on the show when you're done these next two and share your further findings. I'm very, very keen to hear more.
No worries. I'd love to. Amy?
Hmm. Well, thank you very much. I'm really happy that we were able to chat about this today. I have, as some people know, that we've chatted about this previously when we met through Reiki Australia, but it's always nice to hear it again and just not be overwhelmed by all the information. It's breaking it down and really understanding what's going on in the study. So thank you for doing all that work. I'm sure it's
No
taken a lot of your
worries.
time.
It was a lot
It's
of work,
appreciated.
I
Yeah.
have to say.
Yeah.
It's my pleasure. And as I said, I think it's really important that people are informed. And for me, it's not just about making energy healing accessible to other people and informing people about energy healing, but it's also about making people think about their most fundamental beliefs about the world,
Mm,
and I've got no judgment about anyone's beliefs, but I just think that it's really interesting when you look at the research, things like energy medicine, and that there's evidence that it is effective over placebo and so forth, that it really does make you question fundamental beliefs about the way we see the world and the way we see health and the medical model, and
yeah.
obviously the medical model is brilliant. Obviously we couldn't live without that. It
Right.
saves lives all the time. I'm very grateful for it. But when we find research like this, it does throw up the questions of maybe we need to expand that view. Maybe we need
Yeah.
to incorporate and expand how we understand health
Yeah.
and human beings.
And just offering everyone all the options when it comes to managing their health.
Yeah.
Mm. All right. Well, thank you. I would love to share underneath this video where, if somebody wants to read the research that you've done or find out more about you or even ask you a question, how might they do that?
Yeah. So if they have any questions, probably the best contact is just my email, soniazadro@gmail.com would be the easiest.
Yeah.
It's SONIA Zadro, ZADRO @gmail.com. And in terms of the paper that I just published, that was the part that was published was only on mental health, very long. You
Yeah.
might just want to read the summary, but
Yeah.
that was published in Frontiers Journal. But if you actually put in Google Sonia Zadro, SONIAZADRO, and Reiki, the paper comes up
All right.
in PubMed. So for those interested, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, I will link that. And thank you very much, Sonia, for joining me
And
today.
thank you for asking me.
Awesome. And thank you all for listening. We hope we will see you again next time. Bye for now. Thanks for joining me on the Holistic Health Show. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe now and get ready to embark on an incredible journey toward holistic wellness. Until next time, be well and stay holistic.